I think in our culture today we see lots of deep spiritual hunger, awakened oftentimes by circumstance, which reveal the weakness of our humanity, our need for something that's greater, larger, transcendent, our need for God ultimately. I remember on 9/11, when there was that horrible, horrible terrorist act of the planes flying into the World Trade Center. And I caught myself in that current event asking deep questions. Todd Beamer, who was on Flight 93, who said, "Let's roll," he used to come to my house for Bible study. I knew Todd. I knew his wife, Lisa. And he was just getting up in the morning. He was going to go and fly and work a business deal and come home and be with his family. And I remember saying to myself, how can we be safe in this world? But the world has never been safe. What is it about us that we long for safety and security when we've lived in a world where every one of us knows people who lifted their head from the pillow that morning and it never laid to rest on the pillow at the end of that day? Isn't that longing itself, the longing for safety, a longing for the one place where it will ultimately be safe, for heaven itself? I remember asking myself this also on 9/11. What does this mean? And what will this come to mean? Even tragedies can awaken these questions for us. Viktor Frankl, in his book Man's Search for Meaning, a man who had become a psychiatrist 3 years before he was incarcerated in one of the Gestapo or Nazi concentration camps. A man who had been married just shortly before that, and his wife was also incarcerated. She dies in the camp. He suffered horribly in the camp. And when he came out of it, he wrote in this book, Man's Search for Meaning, if there's a meaning in life, there must be a meaning in suffering. And we constantly are asking, what does this mean? How do we make sense of it? If the universe is a crock, if there is no meaning, then why would that question bother us? Unless it reveals to us a longing to make sense of things. Now, Lewis wrote about this also, C.S. Lewis. When World War II broke out, the students at Oxford University were deeply concerned. If you go to Oxford University, you'll see etched in the walls of all the older colleges the names of people who died in World War I. Every student at Oxford at the time World War II began had memories of their parents telling them of siblings who probably died in that war or were injured permanently. They saw people who had suffered. They saw the vestiges of World War I. And now they were on the threshold of being names etched in the walls themselves. Why should they continue with the university education? Lewis preached a sermon called De Futilitate, of futility. For you to believe that there's no meaning or no sense tells you that you're looking for sense. And he says you will never truly find sense because all judgments require a standard unless you look for some transcendent standard. The consequence of that, too, was he preached this sermon, and the university said, will you preach a sermon for the university-wide, not just for your own college? And a few weeks later, he preached a sermon at St. Mary's, the university church, called On Learning in Wartime. Why continue pursuing a university education when civilization as we know it is on the threshold of collapse? And Lewis said, history has always been lived on the threshold of collapse. War does not increase death. He goes on to, he could have said, disease doesn't increase death. Aging doesn't increase death. Accidents don't increase death. Because Lewis's conclusion, death is total in every generation. So we're trying to make sense of our life, but we're making sense on the threshold of our own mortality. Years later, during the time of the Cold War, he wrote another essay picking up on the same theme, living in an atomic age. And with the threat of nuclear disaster, what do we make of this? And he said, we've always lived on this threshold. We always want to make sense. So now we live in a terrorist era. If Lewis was alive today, maybe he would write an essay on living in an era of terrorism, where any moment some suicide bomber could blow himself up right next to you. How do you deal with that unless you are setting your heart on something that transcends the temporality of life's experience and enables us to make sense of it? So I think these are some ways that we can begin to see these longings awakened even in the current events of our day.